Welcome to EJB Talks, Rutgers Blaustein School experts in policy, planning, and health, where we talk with our faculty and staff experts, as well as students, about how the fields of public policy, urban planning, public health, health administration, and public and urban informatics affect your lives. Welcome to EJB Talks. I'm Stuart Shapiro, the Associate Dean of Faculty at the Blaustein School, and the purpose of this podcast is to talk with my colleagues and our alumni about policy, planning, and health, the interaction between these issues, and how they affect people in New Jersey, the United States, and the world. Today, we're really happy to have Professor Kelsey Ralph, who teaches transportation planning in our nationally ranked urban planning program. Welcome to the podcast, Kelsey.
Thanks for having me.
So, how did you become interested in pedestrian and bicycle safety, which has been the focus of some of your recent work, and the reporting of accidents?
Sure. So I have traveled without a car for most of my adult life, living in Los Angeles and London and New Jersey and Anchorage and Albuquerque, all of these places without a car. And so you pretty quickly realize that the deck is stacked against you. And that was sort of always in the back of my mind. But then I got on Twitter and I got angry because I would see these news coverage of crashes, basically saying, girl walks in front of car and dies, or some child is biking and they've been hit by a car, and they were always pretty egregious. Like, the headlines didn't really reflect what was happening, and I felt like we were missing a really crucial link here. And so I don't know, I felt like I needed to focus on safety because I experienced it in my own life, and then I saw what was happening on Twitter, and it made me angry.
Right. So once you sort of expanded off of Twitter and took the approach of an academic here and studied it more thoroughly and systematically, we know the world's not always like Twitter.
Not at all.
What did you find?
Sure. So we reviewed 200 news articles, which, let me tell you, not fun to do, reading about deaths day in and day out for 200 articles. But we found that news coverage of crashes tends to make sort of two big mistakes. The first is that it tends to treat crashes as isolated incidents. So we know, for example, that 100 people die in traffic crashes every other day, or every day. And yet when we cover crashes in the newspaper, it's like, here's a crash on this street, and that's the only crash that's ever existed, right?
Right.
And that's really a problem because it doesn't sort of convey that this is a public health crisis, that this is something that happens sort of systematically with a level of prediction.
Right.
And it sort of absolves us of responsibility, right? A crash just happened.
Yeah, it makes it sound not preventable either.
Exactly. And so then there's sort of no call to action to either engineers or police to sort of treat our roads in different ways. The other thing that we found about the crash coverage was that at a sentence level, it tends to shift the blame towards a pedestrian. Mm-hmm. So the number one way that we talk about crashes involving a pedestrian is a pedestrian was hit. And sometimes we say a pedestrian was hit by a car, but almost always it's a pedestrian was hit.
Right.
No car, no driver, no agent, no cause, no one to hold responsible. And at that sentence level, we know from years of linguistic research and our own experiments on this research that shifts blame. And it shifts blame in really meaningful ways. If we just change the way that we describe a crash, we can get the people reading a news article to sort of attribute the blame to the driver rather than to the pedestrian.
I see. The passive voice is a powerful instrument.
Yes, passive voice, the exonerative tense, right?
I don't think I've ever heard that term before.
I love that term for it, right? We recognize that there's a problem, but we don't really want to dig into what's going on.
Right. So why does this happen? I mean, it's not like the media's in the pocket of big auto accident or something like that.
Right, right.
What's going on here?
There's sort of two answers. The first is that we've seen pretty systematic changes in the media over time, and that now most journalists are basically copying and pasting police reports. And I don't blame them. They're pressed for time, but they also want to avoid liability. So they're just going to take the official um, version of the story from the police and say to the public, this is what we know. And that makes perfect sense. And so in future work with my colleagues, we're going to be looking at how we can change the way police describe crashes to be more in line with the recommendations that we have. But the other story is actually a story about journalists being in the pocket of big automobile collision.
Uh,
um, and this actually, so it's not based on my own work, but it's based on really excellent work from Peter Norton, who found that when automobiles first came on the scene, they were killing lots of people, even more than they were today. And big automobile really needed to stop the outrage, right? They needed to make space for them to be able to drive on the roads, because otherwise the pedestrian safety folks were going to win and there would just be no cars in center cities. And so all the big motor companies joined together to form a news service which would produce reports about crashes. They would provide the crash reports, and then the newspapers would copy and paste them. And at the time, automobile advertising was so central to newspaper revenue that they were able to threaten to pull ad revenue if the newspaper didn't use their version of the story. And so
oh,
we got in this
wow.
habit of reporting stories in a certain way. And we've just allowed that to continue to this day. So to be really clear, I'm not saying that that's what's happening now, but that the
Gotcha.
patterns of reporting that we started back then are carrying over today.
That's fascinating. Everything has its historical roots
It
there.
does.
Uh, that's really interesting. Um, on the police reports, that interests me too, because we know that if the media trusts police in terms of reporting of criminal activities, that slants the coverage. Do you think there is sort of the same type of bias in the way why police, I mean, police have to report criminal activities that way they feel like, so that whether it's to cover up their own abuses or whether it's to present their actions in the most favorable light possible. They don't really have actions to take in the auto accident scenario, I guess, unless they decide not to arrest the driver. And is
Mm-hmm.
that why they're gearing police reports in a particular way? I'm just hypothesizing off the top of my head here.
Yeah, I think so. This is research that is sort of underway and really kind of planned. So we don't know the answers yet.
Right.
Um, and one issue is that the police aren't really trained to be crash analysis experts,
Hmm.
right? You have someone whose main line of duty is dealing with public safety, and they
Yeah.
show up at a crash and they're not super keen to be filling out paperwork and they're not an expert.
Yeah.
And so I think that has a lot to do with it. Um, yeah, I think I'll stop there because I
Leave
don't
it
want to
there.
speculate too much. Yeah.
That's fine. So, how do you think this reporting affects people's decisions to choose to become pedestrians or bike riders rather than car owners?
Hmm. I think that it probably makes it seem like walking and biking is more dangerous than it actually is.
Uh-huh.
So I think it probably puts some downward pressure on walking and biking, but that's speculative. It's
Sure.
definitely what we know for sure is that it changes people's support for public safety efforts.
That's important.
Yeah. So if you consistently read news coverage that says, gosh, these are isolated incidents, you think that the way to improve public safety or traffic safety is to educate pedestrians.
Hmm.
But if you read coverage that's more systematic and comprehensive, you're far more likely to support things like lowering speeds or changing road design, which, as a traffic planner, I know that those things are more effective. And so I really want to encourage journalists to switch what they're doing.
Well, let me let you voice some of that encouragement there. What as an urban planner, let's assume for the moment we can't control the media, and we'll come back to that. But
Mm.
as an urban planner, what types of measures do you recommend in terms of improving bike and pedestrian safety?
I would approach the number one cause of crashes, which is too high of speeds.
Mhm.
So we need to change the way that we assign speed limits in this country. Do you know, Stuart, how we assign speed limits?
I mean, there used to be a federally mandated one on highways, but
There
that went
would,
away.
but that's ancient history. You were dating yourself, sir.
I am.
So the way that we set speed limits is different than any other rule that we have, is that we look at how people are traveling today and we say we will set the limit at what the 85th percentile driver is driving. And so if we build a street that has lots of people speeding, the way that we set speed limits is to say, yep, that seems right to me. There's absolutely no relation to safety in any way.
Huh.
And we are seeing a shift in that. So I would call that the American approach to setting speed limits. There's a Swedish approach, which is 100% focused on the amount of harm that a body can tolerate. It's
Hmm.
part of the Vision Zero movement. And so I would encourage a shift towards that.
I see.
Um, and then with that, we can't just lower speeds. We have to change the way that we enforce speeds. So I'm a big fan of automated traffic enforcement, which happens to
Those
solve
little
some of those.
cameras on top of the traffic lights, yeah,
Yes,
or
yes.
lampposts, or yeah, I
And we can
gotcha.
move them around, right? It doesn't always have to be the same spot, which sort of addresses another issue you mentioned earlier about sort of police and trust and covering up some of the systematic biases there. I think it's really sort of tackling two problems at once, right? Automatic speed
Gotcha.
enforcement can be part of a defund the police movement, or at least a police reform movement, while also improving traffic safety.
Right, and you might get support from police if they are not that interested in filling out the paperwork and spending their time dealing with car accidents.
Individual police officers, yes. Police unions, not so much.
Interesting, interesting. All right, well, we're not going to go there right now, but so the speed limits are set on the at the local and at state levels for most roads, if we're not
Mhm.
talking interstates here, right? So in order to move in the direction that you're talking about, we're talking sort of piece by piece, right? We're talking about doing it at the local level, doing it at the state level. We're not going to see bikes and pedestrians on interstates very much anyway.
No,
So we're talking a state and local issue largely.
right. And the target here should be the places where we know the most collisions happen, which tend to be
Hmm.
these arterial streets. You'll see a Target on one side and a Costco on the other, and then a Trader Joe's. Like that's where the most crashes happen. If we can
Gotcha.
target our speed reform there, that would be great.
I see. And do you know, are there states and localities that are way ahead in this and moving in this direction?
Yeah, one exemplar that sort of comes to mind right away is Washington.
Hmm.
Washington enabled local governments to change their speed limits. And so Seattle just changed all of their local speed limits by default to, I believe, 20 miles per hour.
I see. Wow, that's great. I didn't know that. So let me tie this. We've done a lot of these podcasts in sort of the post-pandemic world and trying to look towards the future a little bit. There are reports of significant surges in bike buying after the pandemic hit. Um, is that something you've seen? Is that something that's going to continue?
Such good questions. I've seen it. I tried to
Uh-huh.
buy a fat bike recently, not
Uh-huh.
available in my city. Um, will it continue? I think the real question is, will our infrastructure be sufficient to let those people keep riding, right? When
Right.
traffic returns to normal, people start driving to work again, will the
Mhm.
streets be safe enough? And if we are proactive and put in bike lanes and continue to have open streets for pedestrians, then maybe. But
Mhm.
it's really an opportunity. But if we squander that opportunity, then I think that we'll see a bike boom followed by a pretty big bike bust.
Gotcha. Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. Although we don't know, post-pandemic, how many people will be going back to work, and how much
Right.
working at home there will be as a result of what we're all experiencing right now. So maybe there's some chance
Yeah.
that there'll be less driving as a result of that. We just don't know right now. All right, I want to hit the media one more time before I let you go here, just because I'm fascinated by it as someone who consumes way too much media in all forms. Um, the media biases and incentives that you've described are an issue far beyond transportation. What has your work taught you about as a media consumer, whether it's about transportation, about the pandemic, or about politics?
Mm. I think it's taught me to be more aware of the time scale of the production of the media I'm consuming. So, what I
Hmm.
mean is that uh, there's incredible pressure on the media to produce quick hits. And
Hmm.
those quick hits tend to have very little analysis and very little interpretation. And so, as a media consumer, I try now to sort of wait 24 hours or so. It's
Hmm.
so difficult to do.
It's hard.
Uh, to sort of be able to get the full story just a little bit later after some processing has happened. Let me give you an example. So I was in a cabin in the woods, completely cut off during
Hmm.
the Capitol insurrection. And I got
Hmm.
back to my phone, and there's 100 text messages, from all of my friends and family asking, what do I think about what's happening? But I had no
Right.
idea what was happening. And I had the pleasure, or I guess horror, of reading about it, with 24 hours, 36 hours of time in between.
Wow.
And it changed the way that I experienced it. And I'd like to try to continue doing that for most news stories.
That's great advice. As you said, it is so hard, and of course, the media incentives in the direction of producing those quick hits just get worse and worse with each passing year.
Exactly.
With social media and 24-hour news cycles, and the need to have a reaction very quickly to everything.
If I
Uh,
hadn't been a professor, I would have started um, a news agency that is not on cable, but just produces videos when we're ready to release them. So sort of like Vox, or you see some of these popping up now. But
yeah,
gosh, those incentives are so broken.
yeah, no, the incentives are definitely incorrect there. Anything else about your work you'd like to share with us?
No, I think I'm good.
Good. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks also to Amy Cobb and Cameron Olson for their always stellar production work. We'll be back next week with another talk from another expert from the Blaustein School. Until then, stay safe.